Hi everybody. Welcome to Open Hour. It's Monday, July 9th, 2018. And we have a lot of people gathered here today to talk about many different things, code of conduct. But for us at Public Lab, it's our 2-year anniversary of even having one. And we wanted to take an opportunity to check in. So my name is Liz. I'm calling in from Brooklyn, and I'd love to go around the room and just listen to people do intros, and I'm going to call them in the order that I see. And first I see Kate.
Hi all, I'm Kate. I'm calling in from Winlock, Washington, a rural community north of Portland. I've been a fan of public labs for years and occasionally participate a bit.
Great, thanks. Next I see Coralline.
Hi, I'm Coralline Key. I'm not associated with Public Lab, but I'm very interested in the work that they do, and also very interested in codes of conduct. I was the creator of the Contributor Covenant, which is an open source code of conduct for open source projects, adopted by 40,000 projects, including everything by Google, Apple, and Microsoft. So I'm very interested in the conversation today.
Great, thank you so much for joining, especially it's our first time meeting you, so thanks for spending time with us. Next I see Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff. I'm in Providence, Rhode Island, and I work on the staff of Public Lab, and I am part of the Public Lab Conduct Committee, and also help to sort of maintain the code of conduct in different ways. And I'm interested in codes of conduct and cultural practices that are codified.
Great, thank you. Next I see, hey, I think, can we moderate this person out, please? Thanks. Next I see Stevie.
Hi, this is Stevie Lewis. I am calling in for the first time on Open Hour from Miami. For the past several years, I've been calling in from New Orleans. So I'm excited to be in a new space, and I'm really excited to share this conversation with everyone. I think there's a couple topics I'm interested in hearing from others on, in experiences that people have had. So thanks for sharing space with me today.
Okay, great. I'd like to welcome Coralline to share a little bit from her perspective, and yeah, get us started off. Would that be okay?
Sure. Of course, I have a deep and abiding love of codes of conduct. I think that they serve a couple of purposes. One is to allow a community and the community leaders to express the values that they want everyone in the community to share. And of course, to provide a mechanism for enforcing following those values, so that people who don't share those values and act out of those values, act out of a difference in values, have an opportunity to either mend their ways or signal that they need to leave the community. I think codes of conduct are really important for keeping communities together and binding people together based on shared values. The other important thing that codes of conduct do is signal to marginalized people that the organizers of a community or of a project or of an event intend for it to be a safe place for everyone to participate equally and without harassment. So all of those things happen when a code of conduct is written, and the most important thing about a code of conduct, though, is not having one or having written one, but rather enforcing it. And I love hearing stories from the ground of organizations and events and projects that have adopted codes of conduct and actually had a chance to battle test them. I'm very interested in hearing those stories so that collectively, as a community, we can get better at enforcement.
Great, thanks. Yeah, here in Public Lab, we have kind of, in terms of the actually enforcing it, we do it in two ways. There's a group of several dozen people working to moderate the online spaces at all times, and we're updating our standards and keeping current with the latest spam styles. And this group is amazing. They're like a global group. So, you know, we're getting new content approved within the hour. They're like moderating every new research note posted on our website at this point. And then we have another group. We have another group for in-person events, which, for instance, like the 3-day event I'm organizing to happen in Newark, New Jersey, this coming week. And for that, we form a conduct committee, which has the responsibility that in case anything happens in person, that they will be the ones to facilitate the issue. And we have multiple modes of possible reporting, as well as the ability to appeal directly to our nonprofit. And I should say Public Lab does have a nonprofit that backs the open community, and not all open communities do have that. But that's what we're working with here. And it's been nice to have, honestly. But we take Conduct Com very seriously, choosing at least one staff member to serve on ideally a 4-person committee that is age diverse, belief system diverse, demographically diverse, so that we're relatable. And how we form that committee, so I actually facilitate it just as I help the community together write the code of conduct, but I didn't actually publish it. And I facilitate the formation of the conduct committees for each event, but I'm not actually on the committee. So that's been an interesting role that's been useful. Did anyone want to add in anything about that or ask any questions?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that around the time that we developed the code of conduct, we also developed this moderators group. And it was actually originally for a different purpose, which was kind of commercial spam on the website. But because of the way our publishing platform works, and because of, I guess, a number of things happening in parallel, that group ended up seeing a lot of new content before anyone else. And so it began kind of like having to be not deconflicted, but like, there's another word I'm looking for that's like that. And like now I think the moderators group has a lot of overlap with the conduct committee. The conduct committee handles much more serious issues, and the moderator group knows that it can escalate things sort of to the conduct committee. And also the reporting for conduct violations goes to the conduct group. But there's also like a little flag icon next to anything on the Public Lab website that goes to the moderators group. So there's a little bit of entanglement there, but I don't think it's caused trouble in practical terms because the two groups are in pretty good contact. But it helps because I think that the labor involved in being on the conduct committee is pretty substantial, not in the number of things that come up, but in the seriousness of the things that come up, versus the moderators group is something that is a lot of work because of the number of things that come through. Lots of people trying to advertise gutter cleaning and like, I don't know, new socks and stuff. And so that, but it's also one that we can more easily get a community to work on together. And so those two kind of work together, because I don't think it would work well to have a conduct committee that was as open and as collaborative as the moderation committee. So there's kind of like an interdependence there that's interesting to me.
I think that makes a lot of sense too. If you think about a system in terms of consent, spam is a violation of consent, just as harassment is a violation of consent. So a lot of community moderation, it makes sense, comes down to enforcing levels of consent.
That's a great point that I'd love to hear more about, but we were just joined by Jace, and thanks for identifying yourself. We didn't know who it was. Could you just introduce yourself to everybody and share a bit of your background? And then we'll continue with where Coraline just left us.
Sure, and I'm glad to do it. And I apologize for the botched entrance into the meeting. I managed several of the different Kubernetes special interest groups, and they'll have different Zoom accounts, and they'll have different settings. So it's like, oh, how to make yourself look like a troll in 3 easy steps. So yeah, my name is Jay Singer-Dumars. I am the open source governance program manager for Google, and I work for Sarah Novotny, who I'm hopeful that most of you know of. And essentially, what I'm trying to do is bake inclusion and diversity and a lot of other initiatives that we're collectively trying to move forward into things like governance models and ways that we can bootstrap those things into new emerging open source projects from the get. So it's not an afterthought that basically diversity is a first concern for all things and inclusion is part of everybody's governance model. So code of conduct is a key concern. It's something that I'm working on the Cloud Native Compute Foundation's code of conduct right now, and also the Kubernetes code of conduct it's not really formed yet, but it's going to be like a committee. And essentially, it's responsible for reviewing code of conduct violations, enforcement, all that stuff. So part of my job there is to actually craft the enforcement language. So I would love to, I'm very interested in hearing how other people have dealt with particularly thorny issues like that. So this is really good for me. My background, I've been in open source for, 15 years plus. I have a background in technical operations, so I'm not on the developer side, but more the classic IT ops realm and DevOps. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wow, thanks so much. That's that's a crowded nutshell. I look forward to hearing a little bit more from you as the conversation goes on. Coraline, did you want to add anything more about what you were just talking about in terms of consent? Maybe for some of us here or not so much, but I think generally this is still kind of new language. Is there any way that you kind of introduce this kind of framing when, I mean, your impact has reached far and wide. I know you've introduced a lot of people to some of these concepts. I wonder, do you have any successful ways of explaining this?
Well, consent as a term, I recognize is a little bit loaded, but basically, if we're all programmers here, or DevOps people, sorry, Jace, we have this notion of an API, right? And an API can be public or private. And a public API has certain rules associated with it. There are certain ways that you're allowed to interact with a public API and certain ways that you can abuse a public API to use it for nefarious purposes, right? Well, I think as individuals and participants in a community, we all have our own public APIs. And one of the things that a code of conduct does for us is it outlines the rules around engaging with our public APIs. What sort of actions are allowable, which actions are not allowable, and what happens in case of an attack, a DDoS, someone using a weakness against you, a security threat of some kind, or a spam. Spam's a form of DDoS too, right? So, so yeah, when consent is basically saying, these are the ways that I am willing to be interacted with. These are the appropriate channels for communicating with me via my public API. And consent is something that has to be mutually respected by both parties. Otherwise, you end up with some kind of violation, a boundary violation, an emotional trigger, a trigger of code of conduct enforcers needing to do something to remediate the situation. But I think you can view it through a lens of consent, and that sort of humanizes it and personalizes it. So it's less about the community and more about the individual.
Thank you so much. Now, Kate, I've been there in the OpenStreetMap community as well, not to the extent that you have, though. I wonder if you could, and many of us, Jeff as well. I wondered if, what's your perspective nowadays? What have you guys, what's been happening, and where do you think it's going next?
Well, I would say we're moving slowly. And, there's usage of code of conduct in different aspects of the project, but there's not a universal code of conduct that covers all of our spaces. So, for example, I'm one of the organizers of the State of the Map US, which is the US OpenStreetMap conference. And we have a code of conduct, also an enforcement team, and a whole plan. And we do other things around diversity and inclusion, such as having scholarships and encouraging first-time speakers and those sorts of things. But then in the global online spaces, it can be much more difficult. I mean, there's technically etiquette guidelines, but it's difficult. Moderation can be quite sporadic. And I think we're moving slowly forward. I mean, it's not just about gender, but I think there's more women involved anecdotally than there used to be. I have my dubious claim to fame is I'm the longest, I've been a member of the OpenStreetMap Foundation the longest, the woman that's been a member the longest, as well as a board member who served her entire term. And so there's movement. It's just, I think at least I would like to see things move more quickly, but community doesn't always work that way.
Jace, do you want to give any examples of how a code of conduct has been tested and something you learned from it?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So there was a recent incident. I won't go into a lot of details, but I'll give generalizations about what happened. Essentially, in a community interaction, a female member of the community was engaging with not a leader of one of the governance bodies. Our governance bodies are special interest groups, but a sort of subgroup of that, so an organized effort underneath of that body. And the person in question that this woman engaged with was heavily intoxicated. And he did not overtly say or do anything in that particular interaction that was threatening or a violation of the code of conduct per se, but the woman in question felt threatened because she felt like the person did not have control of their faculties and could at any moment do something rash or unpredictable. And they shared an Uber to some other thing. They were at a conference when this happened. And so the whole time she was really concerned that, wow, what's going to happen next? Nothing happened per se, but it was this sort of dread that comes with when you're trapped in an enclosed space with somebody who could at any moment do something unpredictable. And that's a really interesting challenge from a code of conduct enforcement perspective, because as I tried to bake in a statement into the enforcement around our code of conduct that says inebriated interactions under the guise of community interactions are simply not acceptable. And I got a tremendous amount of pushback from people about, well, people drink at conferences, and does that mean that if two people are talking and one person has a beer in their hand that they're not able to have that? It's like, oh, so that was a really interesting and as of yet unresolved edge case about things like intoxicants. I mean, for me personally, if I could just wave my magic wand, I'd say that intoxicants have no place at a community meeting or community gathering in the first place. And that would be a way to eliminate some of those things, but that's simply not a reality. These things happen all the time.
Can I make a suggestion, Jace?
Yeah, sure, fire away.
It's less about the behavior of the person who's intoxicated and more about how the person in his company felt. So your code of conduct can emphasize that every person in a space or participating in an event has a right to a feeling of safety. And in that case, you're not rules lawyering people away from being able to drink at a conference, but you are saying if you're putting someone else in a position where they don't feel safe, then we have an issue that we need to discuss.
Yeah, and I think that that's probably the grounds that would happen. I will tell you the very unfortunate second part of this, which is the person withdrew their comments or withdrew their concerns when they were faced with having to go through the process of reporting and taking another event like that, feeling not safe. Because this is the classic bargaining down that victims engage in, where it wasn't that bad, I didn't feel that unsafe, I just wanted to bring it up. And so I worry about having language like that puts a little bit of the effort back on the victim to prove that they felt unsafe, as opposed to eliminating the situation in the first place, where if somebody is clearly doing something that's outside the conduct, then the onus is on them to explain why they were in that state in the first place. Because victim mentality in that state is often just about trying to avoid further conflict. So I don't know. I mean, it's a good. I mean, you're spot on, I think, in terms of the conduct code as is, but this gets into really tricky territory about victims having to own them.
Yeah, that reporting system needs to be as friction-free as possible, and needs to be designed in such a way that it does not place a burden of proof on the person who witnessed or is experiencing the violation.
Yeah, agreed.
If I could pause you right there, let's not lose this thread, but I want to welcome the new caller. It's a 917 number. Hi, want to introduce yourself? Hi, it looks like you're unmuted, but if you want to check, hit *6 from your phone. Okay, they left. Not sure what that was. Okay. Yeah, so burden of proof. Jeff.
Yeah, I've been thinking about maybe a related issue, but one way that I guess I'd like to hear from people about is so like and sometimes I feel like the earlier actions and earlier kind of like behaviors or whatever can help to prevent those situations from emerging in the first place. And I guess I want to propose like maybe like I worry that people get stuck in thinking about like, hey, is a code of conduct about like persuading people not to violate a code of conduct, or is it about delineating what should be done to people who do violate a code of conduct, or is it about reassuring people about a safe space? And it's a little bit of all of those, I guess, and other things too. But one thing that I think is a sign of a code of conduct working well, and like not just the code, but the practices around it, is like if, for example, in the scenario with the drinking, if it was made clear in like not, like long before there was that situation emerging, it was made clear that that's a potential situation that could make people uncomfortable and to watch out for it. And also for other people in that space to be looking out for and acting in such a way as to make sure people don't feel safe and like rightfully don't feel, or do feel safe and rightfully do feel safe because they feel that there are other people around who are going to be there for them. And what that does is it doesn't eliminate the need for more severe enforcement. In fact, I actually think that it may allow for more strict enforcement should those initial steps not be sufficient to prevent something. And so what I worry about is people saying, no, we should just be like nicer and build good culture and that will solve the problem. I actually think that those things are really important, but they allow us to be far more strict when things get really serious. And that's just an idea, but just putting it out there because I think we shouldn't have to choose between talking about the principles we want to live to and like the positive things about a society we want to live in and like really harsh enforcement, which I think is merited in some cases. We should be able to have both kind of, you know?
Yeah, I'd like to say something to respond. I think a lot of times when you introduce a code of conduct, people go with the assumption like someone does something and they get kicked out of the community. And I always think it's like, if you get caught shoplifting, we don't put you in prison for life. You know, there's like levels, and yes, there's scenarios where people might not be welcome in the community anymore, but the idea instead is to help us so we can function together. You know, if people are willing to change their behavior, then there should be a path. And I think that's part of those components of talking about where we would like to be as a community and a society, and then how we want to have a framework in place to allow those things to happen.
I've been talking to the Mozilla Foundation about their efforts around the code of conduct enforcement, and they have the notion of a consequence letter, which outlines different sort of steps that need to be taken depending on the severity of the violation. But their entire approach with consequences is how to rehabilitate the offender and bring them back into the community. So with every level of consequence, it is, here is what we're going to commit to you that we will do to resolve the situation such that you can be an active and healthy member of our community again. And I think that's a really interesting perspective to take.
I do worry about I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, no, I was going to pose a question. Keep going if you were, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to bring up the part of the emotional labor that comes up with this, that people who are the subject to these violations are often people who are conducting a lot of emotional labor on the behalf of people who are unaware of just the simple realities of being a minority, or so I, with the idea of rehabilitating and learning and educating, I think that's important. But I also worry about systems that propagate the emotional labor of people who really should be tired of educating other people about just basic human equality. So hopefully we can create systems that can take that burden off of people so that they're not having to do that emotional labor anymore.
That's an excellent point, and I totally agree with that.
I was going to ask if anyone has any advice or ideas around. I'm interested in a bit about code of conducts and the way that they can use or help people to engage in good ways by providing some guidelines for engagement. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, two things actually. How do you have a code of conduct that will include accounting for people who don't know or understand that that what they're doing is making someone uncomfortable, and like the potential education that would need to go into something like that. And the other one is around microaggressions and how to tease them out and deal with them.
What I've done with Contributor Covenant, and this was a development, I think around version 1.2 or 1.3, it was initially criticized for sort of listing behaviors that were not acceptable. And one of the things that I did is I added our standards section to include examples of behavior that do contribute to a positive environment. So those are enumerated. Those are saying, you know, here's what we want, here's what we need for everyone to do in order for us to be a healthy community. And then following that, enumerating, here are examples of behavior that we can't tolerate. So I think trying to frame things in terms of what you want people to do and not just what you don't want them to do, having a balance there is really important.
Fantastic. Do we want to go over any more anecdotes, kind of case studies of how this has gone right now? Is anything coming to people's minds?
Maybe in relation to Stevie's question about microaggressions, and so like I attended a session by the author of the recently released study on sexual harassment in the sciences. I'm going to look up the information on this and share it in a second. It was at an event a couple weeks ago, and I'll share a link. But the report was it's the National Academies of Sciences report, I believe, like a really big report, and it one of the conclusions of it was that although there are very severe issues, very severe issues that are very serious. The vast majority in number of issues are like less severe, but in the aggregate, more have a larger effect on like many more people. So like I guess I'm paraphrasing, but I guess they're saying that like like the microaggressions and like interrupting and talking over and also everything else, like who cleans up after the meeting and just everything, and so many things. And it was interesting because at the event that I was at, I saw that happening a lot. And it's hard to formulate like a report. Like, you know, you could have a very long list. It's very hard to report that. You know what I'm saying? And you'd be like, this person said this person said that, and just keep going. So I'm wondering, like, what is the structure to respond to that kind of thing? And one thing on the positive side that I did see was people not aggressively, but like very intentionally, like saying, excuse me, that person was talking, and like constructing society in that way. But it's a different mode, you know?
I think one that I've struggled with personally, and I've seen happen with other people as well, is like who eye contact is made with when you're in a group conversation, and how do you like document that? Like, I don't know. I guess you could write it in as like a good practice.
I think one of the ways you can address that too, of course, to the emotional labor point that Jason made earlier, you can't expect the people who are experiencing microaggressions, especially in the aggregate, to be policing other people's behavior. So I think it's really incumbent on organizers to model the kind of behavior that is expected of everyone in the group, and to be the ones who actually call out if someone is acting in a microaggressive way towards someone else. That's the point where allies need to step in for marginalized people, and it's not a matter of staying in your lane at that point. It's a matter of being a good ally, and I think that allyship it's everyone's responsibility, but it's especially incumbent on organizers.
It seems like we're all coming from communities where the large majority of people are abiding by a code of conduct and upholding it. But it strikes me that the OpenStreetMap community, at least I'm on the diversity working group list, and while there may have been like an original code of conduct, there's the sense that it's not enforced, or there's a sense that there's not a code of conduct. Kate will correct me. I'm counting on it. But I wanted to bring up some of the attitudes that actually aren't unique at all to OSM, which is a community I also love. The kind of attitudes that we're here unpaid, right? We're in peer production. We're coming, as many of us, volunteers. Although there's plenty of people paid to work on open source, but let's say that the community interactions are voluntary. And something I hear from kind of corners of association that haven't really yet adopted codes of conduct are that, this is our culture, and what we already have is our culture. And, to try to put something against our culture is culturally insensitive. And I just wondered if anyone here might have any anecdotes, perspectives on either culture in general, or specifically how to engage with that particular take on culture.
Well, and I can speak a little bit to, I think people try to draw a line of who is in the OpenStreetMap community. Like, if there's plenty of people who are paid to work on OpenStreetMap, and they almost try to draw the line and be like, well, you're doing it for work, you don't count, or you're doing it for this other reason, you don't count. And I think a lot of that, I think that ends up being a lot of it. And one of the efforts some of us have made is to be like, everyone is the community. So we're not trying to change your thing, it's our thing, and we have just as much say in that as you do. Because there's definitely, I think, this effort to draw a line versus, we're making a free map of the entire world, and it represents the world. So, the people making it need to relate to that representation. And, that doesn't always work because people still want to draw those lines. But I think that is really where that attitude tends to come in.
Wow, great. Thanks for that, Kate. And you mentioned the world, which kind of brings me to something I wanted to put out there. I think it's about the really long-term impacts that what we're doing as open source communities here with codes of conduct, the long-term possibilities. And then also some preceding work that we don't always, have it front of mind. And I'm thinking of the kind of principles of community organizing that have come out of the civil rights movement, the environmental justice movement, particularly for the public lab community, because we are associating with ourselves with the goal to have a positive impact on environmental human health. And that's a kind of work where there are already active standards, such as the HIMES principles for democratic organizing, Now, where am I going with all this? I wanted to bring up, I think, a potential area where we might see the principles by which we are democratically associating. And I think there's a lot of consent in the way I use the word democratic. I'm not talking about voting here. I'm talking about respect. And I think there's a lot of potential reach for the work we are doing here among groups of people who are more or less freely associating to build on the work of people doing place-based organizing, but who haven't maybe in the past put out such huge structures for accountability. Okay, that's a lot of words, but let me explain what I'm talking about. There's a very recent issue going on. Probably everyone heard of the Flint water crisis. I wanted to bring up a website that's just, I just read it today, actually. It's called Flint Complaints, and I'm sharing it in the chat. And I want to mention that this is from the citizens of Flint who are actually asking for where they can file a complaint against a professional scientist that was showing up to help. Now, I'm not trying to wade into what actually happened, although you can read the letter for yourself. What I want to do is bring forward the value of these consent-based democratic spaces where we are leveling status so that people can work together, people from wildly different backgrounds, and show just how broadly this is needed in the world. Okay, thanks for listening. That got to be a rather long comment, but I'd love to know if that gave anyone thoughts.
Maybe to the first part of it. I mean, there's a lot there, and it's thank you for drawing these connections. I do feel like there's this kind of place that conversations can get stuck, where there's a question of whether a code of conduct needs to be democratically adopted, and if not, how does it work? There's this moment between where a very large majority of people agree that we should have a code of conduct, or that that they should have a code of conduct, or whatever. And then some people are sort of vocally arguing against it and saying no, we all have to agree, or we have to use some sort of voting mechanism to agree on this or something. And then there's also a moment when, maybe it's not the ideal, but those people who choose to be a community with a code of conduct may form that community to the exclusion of people who didn't wish to be part of a community with a code of conduct. And that's that's sort of a kind of fallback democracy. But there's something that can be, I think, very ugly about insisting on a process and yet obstructing the very thing that can allow people to operate as a body in a consensual way. But yeah, I've seen that happen, I think, in a number of occasions.
I think it comes down to, in part, the notion of leadership and consent of the governed, right? There's freedom of association involved. I think that's sort of the example you were talking about, but consent to the governed, which I think ties into what I've seen in that Flint complaints document. There are leaders in communities, and it is fine for those leaders to make decisions for the greater good of a community. And that doesn't mean that you have to have 100% consensus on everything you do. What you have to do is maintain the trust of the people in the community that you are in charge of. And sometimes that means that some people will leave because they don't consider to be governed by you, because they don't want to pay their credit, because they don't agree with some value statement. And it's probably for the best, because that means that they're not aligned with the core values of the rest of the community, and they're going to either cause problems or themselves be very uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong with people leaving our community. That's healthy.
I think it can get like really complicated, like in this scenario. And Liz, I have to admit, like, I don't know how, I haven't wrapped my brain around how to think about this letter, which was very disturbing to me as well, in the framework of consent, you know, in this way. But it's something that I think I will be, you know, mulling on for some time. But I do think, like, there is, yeah, like there, outside of the digital world, like, people live in places, and then they, you know, they drink the water of those places, and they have a home with stuff in it, and you know, people they grew up next to, and the questions become ever so much more serious, even than like a temporary event where you're all together for a few days. I guess one thing that this is probably not helpful to that question, but in a similar way, I remember a debate that kind of erupted at a community meeting that I was part of, where someone had acted in a way that was, I think, universally found to be inappropriate. I mean, I don't think there was anyone else in the room who felt that that was an okay way to act. And yet there was a question of it being a public meeting in a public meeting space of this sort of hosted by the city, whether someone could be asked to leave a public meeting. And I found that to be really pretty ugly, but people just didn't know how to categorize that in their brain. They didn't know how to think about that question. And there was even a law enforcement officer there who was kind of hosting this. We had to hold it in a police station, which we didn't really want to, but there was like, that was the community room for the city. So, but, and he was like, I don't think we can ask someone to leave. And we were like, if someone came in like with, I don't know, like a very loud bell and kept ringing it, we would ask them to leave. If they came in with like 20 dogs, we'd probably ask them to leave. So like, how is this not something that we have the grounds to ask someone to leave on? So it's, yeah, I mean, adding to the complexity here, but I do understand that people like me have trouble sometimes fitting it into a frame where they can understand how to address something structurally.
If I can add one thing, something that I tried to get across to the people who are framing the code of conduct that I've been working on is that there's two ways that you can engage with a code of conduct. One is intellectually, psychologically, curiosity, reading it, understanding. And the other way is you're a victim and your life has been basically altered for maybe the rest of your life. And you're reading this to understand what are your rights, what is going to happen? How do I engage with this situation that my life is now fundamentally altered? And when you weigh those two things together, the person who is engaging it from that perspective of victim should obviously be the clear owner of the majority of weight and concern in the thing. So I've used that as a way to explain to people why code of conducts and these things about public spaces and consent are not, they're not theoretical. They're only theoretical until you're a victim, and then these become very real. So I think that that's one way to sort of put the balance of scales across these things that we do and say, if you're a victim, put yourself in the victim's shoes and see how you would respond to dealing with this. You know, imagine somebody you love, your spouse or a child. You know, that would be something that I think could help people understand this in a maybe more visceral way.
Thank you so much. And I'm getting messages in the chat that people have to go. So I want to call for any last comments. And thank everybody so much for spending this time with us. Kate, would you give us anything to close?
I was still thinking about sort of what Jeff said, but just how, you know, you interact between like your local community and these open source communities, and in dealing with code of conduct is definitely in some ways made it more difficult for me to figure out how to interact in the community, regular general community spaces, you know, because you would like there also to be a code of conduct there in some ways, but it doesn't work the same.
Wow, great point. Coralline, any last thoughts?
I'm just really happy that conversations like this are taking place, and that conversations like this are taking place in a public forum. I think there's a lot of discussion around like, oh my God, should we adopt the code of conduct? And a lot less discussion about, okay, we have one, now what? So I'm really thrilled to see this conversation happening, and very happy to have been a part of it.
Thank you so much. Jace.
What Coralline said was exactly right.
Okay, great. Stevie.
Yeah, I think I've done a good bit of thinking now. You know, like one of the final thoughts I'll leave on is that it's interesting that to think about we rely on institutions to help us enforce these codes of conduct, but what does that look like now in public spaces? And I'm just looking at this letter, it's like the Flint community wrote this to the scientific and engineering communities. Like, what? Anyway, so it's something I'm just thinking about. So thank you for all your ideas, and have a lot more to move from here.
Great. Jeff?
Well, I mean, like, I feel very strongly like a sense of like they didn't know who to write to, or like they know exactly who to write to.
Yeah.
It's the institution, but they don't know like who specifically can be held accountable. And you know what I'm saying? And it's frustrating. I don't know that like there was a response from this Dr. Edwards, you know, but is there a response from the institution? And is, you know, in the way that like there was this, you know, for example, the report on sexual harassment of women, it's a very broadly, it's like 300-page document. I hope that there will be more people thinking in that frame, and that there can be a response that is as serious as this one. And this report is only the beginning. I mean, it's just a study with recommendations.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I want to thank everybody for being on this open hour, and I am just so happy to be part of thinking over everything with this great group and the broader community as well. So stay in touch. You can always find us on publiclab.org/chat. We're always in there. And we're also participating in the Mozilla Diversity and Initiative group as well. So thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.